guys. So tonight we're very fortunate to have Mr. Graeber, who is Westminster class of 1987, here to talk with us about the most recent discoveries of cancer treatment involving unleashing our immune systems, which is called immunotherapy. When I was about 11 years old, one of my friends passed away because of leukemia. And that was the first time I realized losing someone was possible, and I realized how intimidating cancer is. I started to study biology and medicine, and I learned why cancer is so challenging. Unlike viruses and bacteria getting into our body, with cancer, our body cells are sick. Cancer is about quite overgrowth that become fatal. A lot of cancer therapies were harming the cancer cells, at the same time also harming our own body cells. But there's a hope, a completely different type of therapy people have been studying. I recently read Mr. Graeber's book, which is called The Breakthrough, and he explained a lot about the magic of the immunotherapy. The Breakthrough was shortlisted as the 2019 Medical Book of the Year by the British Medical Association. Mr. Graeber's work has also been honored with an Overseas Press Club Award for Outstanding International Journalism, a 2012 New York Press Club Prize, an American Poets Prize, a National Magazine Award, and several National Magazine Award nominations for feature writing. His long-form narrative nonfiction has been anthologized in collections including the best American crime writing, the best American science writing, the best American business writing, the best of 10 years of National Geographic adventure, the best of 20 years of Wired, and the best American magazine writing, as selected by the American Society of Magazine Editors and the Columbia University School of Journalism. Without further ado, please give a warm welcome to Mr. Graeber.
I guess I'm going to stand here-ish. Thanks for coming in. Yes, it's true. I went here. Some of my former teachers are in the room. This is Stephen. Anyway, had a great education here. Survived. Didn't know what I was going to do. Don't still totally know what I'm going to do, but I will tell you a little bit about what I have done, and specifically centered around this book here. I'll talk for about 40 minutes and then open it up to questions. Pretty much, I don't usually use this thing, PowerPoint. So, in fact, I was holding this upside down. So, I'm going to use this kind of as a crutch, and also so you don't have to stare at me the whole time. It's a picture of my book. The way to start probably is to talk about a little bit about what I do as a writer. As mentioned, I'm a journalist and a long-form narrative nonfiction writer, which is to say I find interesting stories and tell them at as much length as they'll pay me for, and publish. And usually in magazines like Wired or National Geographic or Business Week, or really wherever wherever they seem appropriate. And I didn't really specifically have an interest in cancer. I'll admit, I tend to write about whatever's interesting. The most interesting, important thing, ideally the most interesting, important thing that people don't know about. And as also mentioned, my background was in poetry. I was writing dactylic hexameter in Mr. Hopley's Latin class. That would predate me, but was the only thing I could do in that Latin class, turns out. But I found out nobody much was interested in reading poetry, and maybe not even me all the time, so I started writing in full sentences, and then finding that if you jump off a cliff while you're reciting your poetry, people pay a lot more attention to it, which got me into National Geographic Adventure, things like that. So the stories that I would be normally doing, I just thought I'd run through a couple. You can talk about that if you want to. My previous book is called The Good Nurse. It's based on the fact that the most prolific serial killer in American history talks only to me, and he killed about 400 people as a nurse in New Jersey and Pennsylvania, and serial killers are actually kind of boring, believe it or not. Sociopaths are not very interesting people, but what was interesting was the fact that the hospitals seemed to know what was going on and kept passing them out the back door. So we worked at 9 different hospitals over the course of 15 years and kept on moving on. And so it's really a whistleblower story, which maybe a movie this year we'll see. I can talk about that too. But so this is the sort of stuff I do. Breaking the cross-country cannonball run speed record, 32 hours, 6 minutes. Here's a really poorly advised story I did where I decided to drag a rowboat up the Ganges, which has a fecal chloroform count 300,000 times what the WHO considers safe, so that was not a good idea. I thought first I'd be rowing, and I brought handy wipes, but I ended up to here, and the working title was it's a holy river, but it's filled with fecal matter, so I call it Holy Shit. National Geographic Change. Talking ahead of DARPA about turning the light on the dark web and tracking sexual predators. Killer cassowaries in New Zealand. Found one. Flew into the Japanese tsunami and earthquake zone and ended up living with the survivors of the city of Kamaishi. First canine cloning lab. I just found that picture online. It's not even a picture of dog cloning, it's just 2 dogs. That's the fire in the Alberta oil sands. I went out and moved in my car in the middle of that and found some people that had driven out of it. But it's really an environmental story. I did that for Business Week. It's about sustainability of taking oil out of sand and really fossil fuels in general, but crazy fire. There's a reason I'm going through all this in this order, besides the fact that they just happen to end up that way in the slides because I don't know how to do this. Kim.com, I don't know if you know who this is. I ended up living with a criminal named Kim.com. I was living under house arrest with him in New Zealand. He had a website called Mega Upload, so if you've ever watched a movie online without paying for it, you probably frequented his site. And he's this, well, it's probably a better picture of him here. He's this rather flamboyant ex-German, ex-hacker living in a castle in New Zealand that was raided by the FBI and SWAT team from New Zealand, based on a search warrant that was assigned by Hillary Clinton. It was the largest copyright violation case in the history of the United States. And all these stories have in common, if they have anything in common, is that there's an exciting story there, but there's actually really a point. And this point happened to be, it's all about whether you can really, what copyright violation is all about, what fair use is all about, due process. He may be extradited to the US within this year. So I was writing all these stories, and a lot of them in between the Good Nurse, which took me a long time to write that book. And I started interviewing him again for a documentary, so I was flying back and forth to New Zealand, and I was supposed to write another book, but I hadn't started anything. And while I was doing that, I was sitting on an airplane for a long time next to a guy I didn't know. It's a really long flight with an open bar, and eventually ended up talking to this guy, which I wouldn't normally do. I usually avoid that. And he said, well, what were you doing in New Zealand? I said, I was living with this criminal mastermind. He said, wait, who? And I said, well, Kim.com. He said, wait, no way. I read a story in Wired about him, this big thing about the raid. It's this really, secret rooms and dogs and explosions. And he said, well, yeah, I wrote that. He said, well, turns out I read all the stories that you just saw. And so we talked about that for a little bit. And he was a PhD biologist. And I said, all right, well, look, here's a bunch of interesting stuff I found. What's the most interesting thing you know that I don't know, ideally? And he told me this story, which I will summarize. It took me 5 years after talking to him to be able to think of it in this way, and I didn't fully understand what he was saying at the time, but he basically answered the question, why is it that you always know when you've got a cold or the flu? Because it's obvious, right? You have symptoms, runny nose and fever and all that sort of stuff. But you need a test to know whether you have cancer. Why is that? Why are there really no symptoms of having a little cancer? And that question had never occurred to me before. It was a really, really profound question. And I knew that the whole idea of the cold, say, was that your immune system was doing its job. We've got this great built-in system evolved over 500 million years that recognizes stuff that's not supposed to be in you, that could do you harm, identifies it, kills it, gets it out of the body. And you do that a lot. It's working all the time. And the immune battle that you're having shows up as symptoms. right? And so that's how you know when you're sick. Most of your sickness is not actually the disease, it's your reaction to the disease. So then why doesn't that happen? Oh, I've still got a Kim up there. Why doesn't that happen? Oh, there's more Kim. That was a weird one. Why doesn't that happen with cancer? Why don't we know? And it turns out everyone knew the answer to this, and they had known the answer to this for a very long time. It's because it's impossible. The immune system can't recognize cancer. It's a waste of time to try to get the immune system to recognize cancer. And what this guy told me in this lecture, or not this lecture, in this conversation, was he said basically, cancer has tricks. It instead of being attacked, it uses almost like a secret handshake to tell the attacking immune cell, hey, I'm cool, I'm one of you, don't attack me. And so it turns off the normal response. And now that we know that, we can actually block the trick, essentially block the handshake. It's almost a physical thing. It's with a drug or an antibody. And then it's like turning on the lights, and we can see cancer, and we can cure cancer like we cure other diseases. And I thought, that's insane. That's the biggest deal I've ever heard of. I mean, this is, I'd never heard of anything about this. Surely if this was true, I would have heard about it, we'd all be hearing about it, we'd all be talking about it, right? This is 5 years ago. So when I got back, I did some research and started looking into it and found that, yes, this seems to be true. I mean, there are studies, there's a discovery, and I'll get into all of that in a moment. And so I did lunch with my agent. When you write books, you've got a book agent who bugs you to make her money. And I was supposed to write the next book, and she said, so what do you think about it? And I told her about this, and she said, well, that can't possibly be true. I would have heard about it. That's not the story. But I'll ask my father. Her father's an oncologist, a cancer doctor, very well respected, well known. She came back to me and said, I talked to my dad, and my dad said, yeah, we tried that. It was called immunotherapy, and it doesn't work. So that's not true. So I said, no, let's continue with this. So we went to try to find a publisher to write about this. Publishers had the same sort of reaction. If this was true, I definitely would have heard about it. And they agreed to let me do it anyway for a small business, which was going to be hard to live on. And so I started digging into this story. I started going to conferences, calling scientists, a lot of MD, PhDs. This is a good time to explain that a large part of my job, I never know anything, or I usually know very little about whatever it is I'm going to go do. So I'm usually the dumbest guy in the room every single time, which is kind of a difficult process to go through over and over again. But my job is to I know nothing, and I find experts that know a lot, and I'm hoping that they're patient enough to explain it to me. So I started going to these conferences, and I also knew that much like those other stories, if this was important and true, it also, ideally it had to be exciting, right? I wanted there to be a story because I hate boring books. No one wants to read a boring book. I thought this was important information to get out there. And I got very lucky here because it turns out that this invention, in addition to this discovery, in addition to being true, and very, very new, so new that most people didn't know about it. My father's a physician. He did not know anything about this. None of the doctors in his hospital knew anything about this. I didn't meet anyone who did. But actually, it's very old. And it starts really, one place to start the story, I started with a 17-year-old girl, it's Bessie Deschel on the right, living in New York City. She happens to be good friends with this guy here, who happens to be John D. Rockefeller Jr. And she takes a train trip, cross-country train trip in 1890. And she comes back, and she's got a medical complaint. She thinks she's pinched her thumb in a Pullman car, in something that doesn't exist at all anymore. But basically, it's like when you move the seats, and she's pinched it in the seat, and it hurts, and it's not getting better. In fact, it seems to be getting worse. And so she goes to see, on the advice with the opinion of John D. Rockefeller Jr., this specialist, this guy in the middle, this guy named William Coley, who was this young, hotshot surgeon, fresh into New York, out of Harvard Med, full of idealism and dreams, and ready to take on the world. Bessie Deschel was basically one of his first patients. Beautiful young woman with this relatively simple complaint. He took a biopsy, tried to figure out what it was. He couldn't, it was spreading. It seemed to be a cancer, sarcoma, it turned out. And at that time, really, the only thing they could do was amputate. So he amputated her hand and then her arm, then more of her arm, and over the next months, it just continued to spread. And this beautiful young girl turned into this misshapen wreck, living on opium and alcohol and nodules all over her body, and died in 6 months. And this guy, William Coley, just thought that was unacceptable. It was 1890. The world was full of wonders, right? You know, Pasteur was doing his magic. New lakes and continents practically were being discovered just down the street from where his hospital was on the Lower East Side. Tesla and Edison were battling it out over what kind of electricity should work out, laying the first electric grid. It was a time when it seemed like anything was possible, right? And so we thought, well, let's cure cancer too, right? We can do that. We just rethink it. And he thought maybe the best way to do this, I think I've got another messy picture, yeah, anyways. Best way to do this was to see if anything had ever worked before and to look at it in a different way. And so he went searching through the medical database. He went looking at the old material again to see if he could find anybody that seemed to present like she did but had a different outcome. And so to do that, you had to dig through these big old books, medical books, you know, the medical records. Everyone that ever walked into Memorial was logged in boilerplate script in a giant dusty leather book. And he flipped through all these things, and he found, going back 7 years, a German house painter named Fred Belf, some guy that had come off a boat, moved to the tenement slums of the Lower East Side, and had eventually walked into the gates of Memorial as what they called a hopeless case. He had a giant tumor on his neck that was, and another one here, and it couldn't breathe, another one was growing there. And the only thing that they could do, the chief surgeon at the time, this hotshot named John Bull, was of course cut it out. So they cut it out, but cutting it out, they couldn't even close the skin. There wasn't enough left. And so now this guy, this hopeless case, is lying in a bed next to a lot of other very sick people with an open wound in a pre-antiseptic age. And sooner or later, inevitably, he developed an infection. And this was an infection that was pretty common in hospitals at that time. They called it St. Anthony's fire. And they've been calling it St. Anthony's fire since the Middle Ages, when this bacterium, Streptococcus pyogenes, what they call erysipelas, would roar through these wards. One person would get sick, and another person would get sick, another person, just spread like crazy, and people would have these high fevers, and they'd go scarlet. And it was called St. Anthony's fire for that reason, because of this redness that would develop, but also, and the way it spread, but also because sometimes after it had cleaned out the ward, those who survived also found that other diseases that they were suffering from, they were no longer suffering from. It seemed to clear out other things too. It was a weird one. So Fred Belf developed this fever, went in and out of fever, was going to die, didn't die. And over the course of 4.5 months, as he suffers there, these giant tumors that started to grow back started to melt away, almost like ice cream, they were described. And 4.5 months later, this guy, who was much sicker, looked a lot worse certainly, than young Bessie Deschel, walked out of the gates of Memorial Hospital, totally, seemingly, cancer-free, and then disappeared into the slums of the Lower East Side, never to be heard from again. And Coley said, yes, right? Let's make what happened to Fred Belf happen to other people. How do we do that? How do we reproduce that? So the first thing you do is kind of a detective story. You go find Fred Belf. You go make sure this story is true, right? Because that's not a real one. That's something. But you know, that's basically what it looks like. It's not a very complete record. You've got to find the guy to see if this medical history is true. So I really wish I would have written a whole book just on searching the tenement slums of the Lower East Side. This guy with 1 year of college German, going door to door, trying to find the guy that had survived cancer and used to have a tumor on his neck, not knowing exactly how to do that. He just knocked on doors and you know, risked his life and had I think a bit of an adventure doing it. And really, against all odds, he found it. brought him back to the hospital, reintroduced him to the surgeon, said, is this the guy? Yes. Talked to Fred, said, did this really happen? And yes, just as described. He'd gone in with this one thing, he'd been terribly sick with this fever, he walked out with another outcome, a very different outcome than Bessie Deschel had. And so William Colby thought, great, let's make everybody sick like Fred Belf was, and we'll cure cancer. So what he did, I have no idea what the next slide is, so, oh, that's not really relevant. So what he did was he took the bacteria, this Streptococcus pyogenes bacteria, and he turned it into a soup. He grew it, this toxic soup, and he wanted to inject it into patients. And you know, what he was describing, what he'd seen, this miraculous recovery. There was no explanation for it scientifically, and there's really nothing in the medical literature, but there have been stories going back for a very long time about what they call spontaneous remissions. These sorts of things had happened. There were always stories. That's what the next slide was, actually. That's a 13th century Saint Peregrine, patron saint of cancer, who had tumors that had erupted. He had a terrible fever, and the tumors went away, and it's a miracle, right? So it's always miracle or magic. Coley thought, maybe it's not miracle or magic, maybe it's science, maybe it's these little bugs we can see through the microscope now, and Pasteur is playing with, and all these other people. So this is his idea, is let's get these bacteria to somehow do something, and let's do it on purpose. Let's see what the next slide is. Right, miracle magic, and then I just ran through miracle in there. So who you're going to find in the 19th century to experiment on, it's going to be another poor immigrant living in the Lower East Side slums. That's pretty much these are the experimental subjects at that point, but they also had nothing else to do. He found a guy known only to history as Mr. Zola, an Italian guy, had a morphine habit to help him through the difficulties he was having with that, but really another lost cause. Mr. Zola agreed, and Coley made this soup, injected it into Mr. Zola, got Mr. Zola's niece to do it at regular intervals. Mr. Zola got terribly sick, developed the same fever, St. Anthony's fire, actually ended up infecting his niece. And that tumor you see melted away, and Mr. Zola walked out cancer-free. Died 20 years later, but of a morphine habit, not anything to do with cancer. So Coley seems to have cured cancer, right? He doesn't really understand what's going on. He doesn't really understand that there's something about the reaction that the body's having to this one infection that is doing something else to this other disease. He doesn't know what's waking up the system. He's using metaphors like that. But he's onto something. And there's the New York Times, 1908, cancer's cured. You're going to see this kind of headline over and over again through history. So this is a fantastic thing. This is the beginning of immunotherapy, really, in this country and worldwide. Because what Coley didn't realize was he had done something to the immune system to make it so that secret handshake was blocked. He'd woken up the immune system. He turned on the lights in some way and allowed cancer to be treated like every other disease. This seemed like it was going to go great, except for a few things. First of all, he gave everyone the recipe for the soup, Coley's toxins, they were called. If you look at my book, I've got the recipe there. You can do it at home. And everyone did it a little differently. And you had to pay a lot of attention as you did it to make sure that the patient would respond. There were a lot of variables that made this seem more like witchcraft than science. Even though he got great response rates. In fact, his response rates, when we look at his data now, look as good, if not better, than anything we have for this type of cancer. But Coley was working at a time and at a hospital right when a new discovery had come about, the discovery of radium. And radium does a great job, the radiation does a great job of killing stuff, killing people, killing cells. It kills tumors, and this seemed really scientific. Now, no one understood at first exactly what the dangers of this were. In fact, all the patients that were treated with radium, there was a 100% cure rate followed by a 100% death rate. They all died of radiation poisoning or other tumors that developed. But this seemed really scientific. And so Coley pretty quickly, yeah, there's radiation. pretty quickly fell out of favor. In fact, he was ridiculed. He died broke with his reputation ruined. They continued to make Coley's toxins as a patent medicine. Park Davis only stopped making it in 1952. You know, you can still get it in Mexico. There's actually someone making it in Germany still under another label. But this was underground stuff. Everyone knew this stuff was voodoo stuff. No one knew how it worked. The immune system was not really understood. It wasn't in play. And so, you know, that followed by chemotherapy really became the ways we treated cancer. Everyone forgot about Coley's ideas. In fact, and they were in disgrace. So you had chemotherapy starting right from the discovery of radiation. Coley also, if that idea was going to explode and expand, it would have done so at Memorial Hospital. Unfortunately, the biggest donor to Memorial Hospital was a mining magnate whose wife had died of cancer, who owned the entire world's supply of radium, including the supply that Madame Curie owned. So they had a corner on the market. They were really invested in radiation therapy. That was not going to work out. And then the American Chemical Warfare Unit in 1949 came up with something that, not to get into the weeds on this, but seemed to be able to kill some cancers. So that's chemotherapy. So from that point forward, what you have as the modality, in fact, for the last 100 years, all we've had, the only way you're going to ever treat cancer is cut, poison, and burn, right? You've got surgery, you've got chemotherapy, you've got radiation. There's no such thing as immunotherapy. In fact, if you were trained as a doctor any time before the last 7 years, maybe even 5, you would never have heard of chemotherapy, and if you had, you were trained against it. It was voodoo science. Everyone had proven that it didn't work. They'd even done experiments on mice to say, you know, if you take the immune system out of a mouse, another mouse, intact immune system, you give them both cancer, it turns out, or something that would cause cancer, turns out the same. So what everybody knew, and the absolute scientific certainty for 100 years, was the immune system and cancer have nothing to say to each other. I think I put a question there. Oh, right, so that's why we've been treating cancer. So the idea is that cancer is this anomaly. Let me back up a little bit just to explain what cancer is. Everyone in the room is getting cancer right now. You've probably gotten cancer like 100 times since I started talking. This is a normal thing. Your cells divide and divide and divide and divide. You're always replacing new cells with old cells with new cells. In fact, it happens so much that you replace your entire body's weight in cells over the course of a year, which is why your rooms are so dusty, frankly. I mean, that's what it is. It's you're shedding all those cells every year. This replication process, you'd think it would be really precise, right, and exact because it's science. But I think I pressed the wrong thing, doesn't matter. But in fact, it's an incredibly sloppy process. The making daughter cells out of a parent cell, which is called apoptosis. It's related to the Greek for shedding of leaves, and sort of similar idea, right? You get rid of leaves, but you still have leaves. But that replication process is really messy. And part of the reason it's messy, or it's not really the right way to say it evolutionarily, but if you think about it from an evolutionary standpoint, it has to be messy, right? Because if mistakes don't happen, mutations don't happen. And if mutations don't happen, evolution doesn't happen. So we are the product of a very messy process. So that messiness is built in. Sometimes that messiness ends up being a rogue cell, a mutant cell, and sometimes that mutant cell can even divide out of control. And usually the immune system just spots those and clears them right out. They're obvious. But every very small once in a while, one of those rogue mutant cells doesn't get spotted by the immune system. Why? Nobody knew for 100 years, but it doesn't get noticed. And that one goes crazy, and that's what we call cancer. So cancer is not the thing you're getting every day and you're getting right now. Cancer is the one that somehow gets away. Why it gets away, I dial back a little bit to explain that too, and tell me if this is getting too far into it. But you have an immune system, right? You've got all these different types of cells that are really good at spotting things that aren't supposed to be there. It turns out there are so many things I didn't know when I started writing this book, and I always assumed that, like, you know, so there are B cells and T cells, and B cells are sort of like Spider-Man. They have these antibodies all over them, and they see the bad thing, and they go, shh, and they spray the antibodies out, and the antibodies gum it all up, and then a big eater, like a thing that looks like an amoeba, comes over and eats that up. It slows down the process. That's what B cells do. Turns out there's this other cell called the T cell. That's really the killer cell. That's the one that is killing sick cells. And I thought that every type of T cell, if it was a killer, it could just see all the bad guys, anything that looked foreign, and kill it. But it turns out that you have a lot of different types of T cells, different flavors of T cells that are each one designed to recognize only one mistake, only one type of bad guy. In fact, you've got 10 to the 19th power different versions of this, different flavors. 10 to the 19th power, to put that into perspective, 10 to the 19th power, if it was 10 to the 19th seconds, it would be 30 billion years. So that's an awful lot of different flavors. And when just the right type of T cell recognizes just the right wrong type of cell, it attaches to it, attacks it, kills it. The way it recognizes that wrong kind of cell, by the way, so you can think of all of your cells as being, they're covered with proteins that look like you. They're U proteins. Sort of, you could think of like a Christmas ham covered with cloves, right? Those are all recognizable self-cloves. The cloves that are foreign cell, a sick cell, they've got these funky cloves, right, that aren't normal. One of the T cells recognizes those. That's the sick cell, that's the bad cell. That's how all immunity works. That's how vaccines work. Vaccines, you just stick a bunch of those cloves basically and you inject them and say, this is what you're looking for. T cells say, oh, let's get ready for that. They build up into a big army, ready for that, and then when the real thing comes with the wrong clove, the clove is called an antigen for people in biology. It's ready for it, right? So why doesn't the immune system do this normally with cancer? Because cancer looks different, right? It's mutated, it's a bad guy cell. They didn't know. The reason that they said it was impossible was that if the immune system did attack cells that were yours, they were mutated. The cells that are yours that are mutated, they look so much like you. Most of the cloves are the same. They're so similar that if you had an immune system that attacked those kind of cells, it would make mistakes all the time. It would attack normal cells. It would attack you regularly. You'd have autoimmunity. And that's really actually much more dangerous than any disease, as we've seen. So we are designed, I'm not using that word, you know, but the thinking was we cannot fight cancer with the immune system. It's impossible because the immune system is not designed to do that. In fact, it's designed against it. And that's what everyone was taught, everyone was certain about it. If you read, if you ever heard of a book called The Emperor of All Maladies, this is the sort of best-selling, knowledgeable cancer book. That's what's in that book. Absolute certainty. There was no question amongst anybody except for a few crazy people, or people that everyone thought were crazy, that called themselves cancer immunotherapists. These people thought that actually cancer and the immune system did have something to say to each other. That if they could figure out a way to turn on the T cell to recognize cancer, then they could cure cancer, basically. But they had no idea how to go about doing that. And that group of people was really vanishingly small. If you were a smart person going into the sciences in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, you would never go into cancer immunotherapy. The idea of having going through all the time to get an MD and a PhD in these two incredible super specialities so that you can understand this incredibly complicated thing to study something that's impossible was stupid. And so most of the best minds went elsewhere, but a few people kept on working at it. And luckily for my story, yeah, so that's how it was. Luckily for my story, we have this guy. Now, while everyone knew you shouldn't be trying to figure out how to turn on a T cell and make it recognize cancer. There are some scientists that are really the best scientists, frankly, the most interesting scientists, the ones I identify with most, who just want to know how stuff works. Just basic questions. How do things work? How does a T cell recognize things? It's a, you know, what's the little receptor that makes it able to see that foreign clove, right? What does that look like? What's the structure like? And this guy here, well, here, I'll do that. That guy, he's kind of a rebellious character. He happens to play harmonica with Willie Nelson. He's told me a lot of great bar fight stories, a lot of pretty wild tales, and he lived a scientific life that way. He's really smart though, and really dedicated to his craft, and he really wanted to figure out how does a T cell work. This guy's name is Jim Alison out of Austin, Texas, and he spent a lot of time trying to figure that out, figure out how does a T cell see something. And in doing that, he kind of accidentally came across this realization that it's not just a matter of turning a T cell on. It's basically he found the first secret handshake. He's the one that realized that the immune system is so dangerous and so powerful that it has to have all these safety mechanisms built into it, right? These off switches, these safety fuses, these brakes. And those brakes are always on, and the T cell is always defaulting to the brake. Instead of going crazy and killing everything in your body, it's constantly saying, are you sure? Are you sure? You have to keep turning it back on. So it's basically has the brake pressed all the time. And cancer, what he discovered, has figured out how to press the brake. Normal body cells know how to press the brake. Normal body cells know how to keep it from doing that. Other normal body cells also have this secret handshake, another metaphor again. The same sort of normal body cell says, hey, I'm cool, don't attack me. It's one of the safety mechanisms. It was Jim Allison, who looks like this. No, it's like that. He's the one that figured out, wait, this is how it works. It's not that the immune system can't recognize cancer. T cells can recognize cancer. They do recognize cancer all the time, but cancer has tricks. And the tricks say, hey, I'm cool, don't kill me, I'm a normal body cell. And if you didn't have those tricks, first of all, it would go crazy in your body. Second of all, you can imagine a developing fetus, which doesn't look like a normal body cell in the mother, the immune system would attack it too. So these tricks are built into us so that we survive. But cancer, the cancer that survives, the 1 in a billion cell, a mutated, that happens to work out and cause cancer, that just happens to have the right trait. And once he discovered that, now he discovered that in 1987. No one really paid attention because they didn't believe it because they said this can't be true. We already know that's impossible. They made it work in mice in 1991. It was only approved as a drug. That handshake, the most famous of those handshakes, it's called, on the one side it's called programmed cell death 1, on the other side programmed cell death ligand 1. It doesn't really matter what things are called. That's the other thing I learned in writing this book. People name things when they discover them, which is exactly when they understand them the worst. So they always name them the wrong things, and it's really confusing. But if you just get through that, you can figure it out. You can call it, Rick and Morty. When Rick and Morty meet, there's no attack. But if you can block this side, if you can block this side, block either of them, anti-PD-1, anti-PD-L1, or what they're calling the drugs, these are checkpoints to prevent cancer from attacking. When you block the checkpoints, you unleash cancer you unleash the immune system rather to kill cancer. And when they did that, they changed the numbers overnight. So suddenly, stage 4 skin cancer, melanoma, which was essentially a death sentence. Right now, with the few versions of this handshake they found, because once they find 1, they found 2, then they find 3. Now there are 9 that are approved. Just in the last few years, the survival rate's gone from essentially 0 to 60%. So that's just with the few things that we found. And the big deal, breakthrough, the reason it's called breakthrough, not because this guy cured cancer, it's done. It's not that. But what's happened is that this is the world is flat to the world is round kind of difference in terms of biology. Something that was impossible, that nobody bothered to look at, no one put any money into, no one, it was the laughing stock of science. turns out to be the way we are going to cure cancer, and in fact are curing cancer, because we've been treating cancer. That was the slide before, that, like Godzilla, right? Is that you can't do anything, you can't treat it like a normal disease, you have to bomb it and just hope that you kill Godzilla without destroying Tokyo, right? You know, and that's why there's all this problem with all the cancer treatments. It turns out that was never going to work, because we're trying to cure a mutating problem with a non-mutating solution. The immune system is nimble, it changes, it's adaptable. It's actually built for this. As I say, it evolved over 500 million years to do exactly this. So what was impossible is now the answer and the cure. So now all the focus and all the direction is going there. So I say there are 9 drugs. I don't know, there's the handshake. Yeah, see. This is going to mean nothing, but I could explain a version of how this works maybe in the questions. But the thing is that they found a handshake at one of these points, but you could find handshakes all the way around. It turns out there are dozens and dozens and dozens of handshakes. In fact, there are so many that this is how many things they're looking at right now. So out of the 9, these are the versions they're looking at. Those are all new. There are actually right now, I think 2,786 different versions of this that are in the clinical pipeline that are being tested or are on their way to clinical trials. So this has exploded. This didn't exist before. It's changed everything. And with that change, I mean, first of all, it's really exciting. We figured out how to cure cancer. So that's good, right? And figured out also that we were never going to cure cancer the other way. But the other big deal of this is now we're paying attention to the immune system, and we're realizing, oh my God, this it's sort of like one of those murder mysteries where nobody knows who did it, and the butler's just sitting there the whole time, just, you know, like, it's the immune system that's been in the room the whole time. The butler did it over and over again. So they're finding this for schizophrenia, they're finding this obviously for MS, diabetes, all sorts of diseases end up being the immune system either having misfiring, having the wrong signal, getting the wrong handshake, these sorts of things. And so this field has just exploded. And now that we understand that, we start to say, well, hold on, this is a huge conversation going on in your body, because 500 million years of evolution creating this immune system, other things have evolved over 500 million years along with us, including all the bugs in our guts, right? So there are, you know, your intestines are filled with bacteria that help you do all sorts of things, but they turn out to be, we work with them. You can't ignore them. And it turns out that the immune system is this very complicated conversation, this symphony of all these groups talking. So, for example, just to make the simplest example of that, they found that in mice so far, and this is brand new over the last few months, if you take, so some people react to these, like the PD-1 blocking drugs. Some people, you give them the checkpoint inhibitor, and they're stage 4 cancer, and there's no hope for them. The immune system just clears out the cancer, and they're cancer-free. When it works, it works. Not everybody responds right now, so they're looking for the other handshakes. But trying to figure out who responds and who doesn't is complicated. But they found that if they have a mouse that does respond to that drug, to, you know, Rick and Morty, and you have this other mouse that does not respond, if you switch their poop, right, fecal transplant, you just change the bugs in their gut, now this mouse responds and this mouse doesn't respond, which is to say they're finding that what you eat matters. What's in your guts matter. It actually might determine whether you have cancer, can cure cancer, can respond to these drugs, which is another thing I didn't know. So again, I didn't know anything about this when I walked into this topic. I suddenly understand what fiber is. I had no idea what fiber, I always thought it was just like something to bulk up your poop, you know, to clean you out. Like the best thing you could do is like eat a loofah sponge and it would just clean you out. I thought it was clean you out. It's not, it's hay for the horses. It's what the bacteria eat. They don't eat you, it's bacteria chow. It's microbiome chow. And it turns out what you feed them matters because you feed enough of the right stuff. So this is why what you eat matters. And they're right now trying to figure out exactly what you should eat, what bacteria you should have, and all sorts of other things like that. So that's a field that didn't exist. It was really squishy science, right? So it's a wonderful thing because, first of all, if you're interested in science, this is a great time to be in it because this door just opened, this completely unexplored field is wide open. And people are running through it, they're grabbing things so fast that they don't even know what they are. They're seeing if they work because they don't understand the mechanism. But nobody looked at it really. nobody understood it. And for, going backwards. And so to a certain extent, nobody could. And this guy, as I said, nobody believed what I was talking about when I started writing the book. As the book came out, that guy won the Nobel Prize. And I'm just going to add one quick thing. It's not a matter of replacing all those other things. You still want to cut out tumors when you can, things like that. It turns out that chemotherapy or radiation works with this stuff too. It's going to have a place because, again, so how vaccines work, how anything works. So if you blow up a cancer cell, you blow it up into a million cloves, right? All those wrong cloves happen. Those get gobbled up by these big eaters, phagocytes, these amoeba-like things, and then they end up wearing those things like victory flags and walking around. They want to meet other T cells and show them what they won. These are like wanted posters, right? For the bad guys. Bad guys look like this. And the best place to meet, there's so many different T cells. They could just float around, or they could go hang out at their local bar where they all go. So they do, and those bars end up being lymph nodes. Didn't know what those were either. Turns out that's what they are, big meeting places where you can do that. So you blow up the cancer cell. So you got all these wanted posters at the same time that you block the secret handshake. And now you've got something that works even better. So these things are working together. All this is brand new. This didn't exist. It was Super Bowl ads last year. 2 years ago, nobody knew about it. And in fact, part of the reason for writing the book, the book was a pain in the ass, I'll tell you, because it's really complicated. Cancer's really complicated. The immune system's really complicated. Every time I think I understand it, I can get about 3 sentences in and realize, nope, don't understand it. You got to be able to, in order to talk about Christmas hams and get gas pedals and secret handshakes, you have to actually know what's beneath them in order to be able to do that. But the reason I thought this was important was because people still didn't know. In fact, the people I wrote about in my book, I wrote about these patients, they only happened to hear randomly sometimes. One person heard from a friend who happened to be an ex-boyfriend who was the lead singer of Imagine Dragons, who said, you should try this thing I heard about. And so happened to go from being sent home to die to a clinical trial where they're trying one of these things to having no cancer. And so when people understand that this is real, because most practicing oncologists didn't, especially in rural and underserved areas, but they understand that there's something else out there, and it's moving so quickly. One of the doctors, the MD, PhD guys that I talked to in this, just say he's got a clinic with cancer patients, but he's also got a lab where he's working on these things. He said, if my plan A is to cure my patients today, but if I can't do that, plan B is to just keep them alive long enough so that they survive to see what's around tomorrow. And he means really tomorrow. It's moving that quickly, and that's never been true before in cancer. It's completely different. So, we get immune to wrong choice of words. You're right now. We get inured to hearing about breakthroughs. In this title, I use the word breakthrough. Got 2 cool pictures of skin. It's cartoony. You can. I'll explain that. Well, that's not going to help you. That's in Swedish. But that means breakthrough. The reason it's called breakthrough, and it says the immunotherapy and the race to cure cancer, as you can clearly see there. I thought hard about whether I was going to use the word breakthrough because that's what I used, and I was going to use the word cure. And I was told by the best minds I could find, no, absolutely, we are curing cancer. In fact, we've already cured some forms of cancer through this. You use the word. You use both words because this is really different. So if you don't understand that it's different, you won't be able to, if you need it, ask better questions, take advantage of it. If you're thinking about science, you won't know that this is real and this is, my father teaches medicine. He's learned everything he knows about this from this book. So, and that's not him, that's just true of a whole generation. So it's a really exciting time to be in this. I'm going to drop it there for a minute. And see where else we want to go. But thanks. I'll take questions. Yeah.
What are some of the side effects that come with immunotherapy?
Oh, that's a really great question. there are different types of immunotherapy. Immunotherapy is anything that unleashes the immune system. So once they figured this out, they've made other types of immunotherapies, like that was the picture I was ignoring, where they say, all right, what if we take a T cell and, the little thing that recognizes cancer, what if we pop that off like a vacuum cleaner attachment, and pop on a vacuum cleaner attachment that recognizes this person's cancer, and you clone it up into like 1 billion cells and inject it into the body. That clears out cancer, the serial killer of cancer. It's amazing. That's a great example, though, of this, because once the immune response, it unleashes a torrent of little chemical signals from all these other players in the immune system, and that torrent they call it cytokine storm or shake and bake more casually. That can be overwhelming. And so you can actually, essentially, if you don't keep it in check, or you don't know what you're doing, or if you're unlucky, you can have essentially an autoimmune response. You can start attacking your healthy cells. You can have fevers that are debilitating. That's a real concern. Side effects are a real concern. But they figured out how to deal with shake and bake it's called CAR-T. So the side effects are, in some cases, they actually can bring on diabetes because it's an immune related disease, an autoimmune related disease. But the benefits have outweighed the side effects massively so far. It's worth, emergency rooms don't know how to recognize this stuff, and they're being educated rapidly on what it looks like. But that's an important question.
One of the things I think that's true with our medical world is that it is amazing what we're able to do. Flip side, the finances of it all. I mean, I remember in your book talking about the cost of some of these treatments, the accessibility. Has that changed at all? What is the accessibility of this kind of treatment for the average person?
Well, in terms of being able to access it, just to even get your hands on it, you really want to be at a good cancer center. Not everybody knows about it. I was speaking in Kentucky, and there were people from rural Kentucky telling me that generations of miners have known that when you get a diagnosis of lung cancer, you might as well just go home. And that's the last time that, at least across the United States, about 24% of Americans even see a doctor is when they get the diagnosis of lung cancer. But lung cancer is responding better than almost anything else to the ones that we have already. So you need to be somewhere where they know about it and they can get it to you. And in terms of the finances, though, CAR-T is costing, with the hospital visits, it's upwards of $1 million right now. You're making a customized cell, delivering it, the hospital stays and all that, and they call that's a financial toxicity that's just as real, and that's a real concern. Right now, that's not true for the clinical trials, but just like I think healthcare costs is another discussion, but a really important one. That's been a real issue. Yeah.
It's a little different, but what's next for you? You continue with this topic, or you try to find something else that you're passionate about and go into that?
Oh yeah, that's another good question. I don't know. I've been on this topic now I've been speaking about this around the country and talking to people that are involved with it for the past year, because it just doesn't stop. It's so new, and there's really nothing else out there that tells the story, and so that's been important, and that's taken my time. And it's so fascinating. It's really hard to drop it because it's changing so fast. But I think for the most part, my usefulness here is somewhat done, so I'm looking for something else, probably something that doesn't involve a serial killer or cancer. Puppies.
What was it that made you decide to go into this field?
Which field? Writing.
Journals and
Yeah, default. It's a really interesting field. I didn't go in a typical way. A lot of people study journalism, something like that. Again, I was a poet. I was lucky enough to study with a poet laureate at Tufts, and was doing that, very serious about it. And then I wanted to travel, so I was traveling, and I was living in Budapest, and running out of money, and living in Cambodia, and running out of money, and found that, I don't know how to do I could draw a little bit, and I could I could write. And what I discovered is it seemed like a real problem not having a speciality, or not having maybe even an attention span for a speciality, but in fact, it's a real asset for this, because I go and I say, what's the most interesting thing? I listen to it, I synthesize it, I have to be able to really live it, and I live with people as I do it. And then I have to be able to put it out in a story that everyone can understand, and then I move on. So it just became something I started to do, and then I did. And it's a great excuse, really. It really is a great excuse to learn stuff, to travel, to meet people, and I'm not supposed to be this involved in cancer. I got into and dropped out of medical school. I don't know anything. But then you learn it. I mean, it took me 5 years to write the book, maybe because that's about as long as it would take to get a PhD or something. So, but then you move on to another topic. So, journalism is a really incredibly rare and precious thing. And I think being a jack of all trades that doesn't know anything, or doesn't have, you're not invested in any one thing, it turns out to be a real asset. And in fact, I get along great with these immunotherapists. They're all musicians, and they're all kind of weirdos because they were involved in too many things. But it turns out that the people that were looking only at one field at a time were missing the bigger picture. So it takes someone else with a different perspective to be able to put all these things together. I'm surprised immunotherapists like this book, and they sold this at the Nobel Prize ceremony. I was like, why? You already did it. But it's because being from the outside and putting all the pieces together is something that those specialists don't do. And so I got lucky that this actually now is something I survive doing and love. I recommend it unless you want to eat. Yeah.
Do you think radiation treatment has reached like a dead end, or do you think both treatments are still relevant and going into the future?
I think they're still relevant, but it's sort of decreasingly relevant. The radiation is useful for blowing up the cells themselves, and it's sort of like a type of therapy, and it can be more precise. But it was never going to cure cancer, and so, I've had some resistance from some radiologists I've talked to about that, and it's still incredibly useful because there's still a lot of cancers that we don't know how to treat. I can get into the specifics of that, but it's so new. We need every tool possible, and everyone agrees that in this field now that it's not going to be. There's no silver bullet. They're not going to find the handshake because cancer is they're all different, right? They're all mutated, and so they're funky. They have all these different tricks, and they develop new tricks. But understanding how that works and having a full range of tools to be able to zap them in whatever way, that's the future. So there are combinations. But through that, they all say, they really do say not sort of maybe we'll cure cancer or whatever. They actually just say, no, we're curing cancer. This is how we're doing it. I didn't know you could do that with a sign.
Have you talked to the authors of the Unbearable Maladies, and how's that going?
I'm having dinner with Author Mukherjee next Wednesday. Because I did call him out in the book and say that it didn't say that. I said nice things about his book, but he's not spoken to me directly about it, but I'm going to talk to him directly. He knows he was wrong. So the thing is that everyone was dead sure. They were trained against it, and so everyone was dead sure that this wasn't even worth mentioning. He doesn't even mention the word, not immunotherapy or immune system once in his book, and yet you can't cure cancer without the immune system. You can't. It's always the immune system. If there's one cell left over, you're not going to chase it down with a chemotherapy or a radio. It's the immune system that always chases it down. It was always the immune system involved. So he's recognized it's a mistake. Ken Burns made a whole documentary about it, and they added a little chapter that's not in the book about immunotherapy. And and he's now actually heavily invested in immunotherapy. He just wrote a piece in the New Yorker about it. So he's trying to. It's not really. Well, I don't know if it's his fault. I think it's really responsible that book's still out, because anyone that reads that as the one book you can't get. I tried to read it. I read most of it, and I didn't really honestly finish it. But if that's the one book you read because you want to know what to do if you've got cancer, it's wrong. You're missing an important part of the picture, and that's, I think, incredibly dangerous because there often isn't a lot of time. So I think he's got to address that in the
Sequel?
future. Yeah, or something, because it's really, he won the Pulitzer Prize.
The history of cancer that he puts in there is interesting.
And it's all right. All that history is correct. And he's got a wonderful, and he's a great writer and a wonderful way with that. He can also raise money like nobody's business. So he's raised a ton of money, mostly in India. I think he raised $600 million for his latest venture. That's something to do with the T cells. So he's very much on it. Everyone recognizes there really are no naysayers anymore. They're just people that are. There's one person talked to me about pharmaceutical companies. There are only two types of pharmaceutical companies. There are pharmaceutical companies that are deeply invested in immunotherapy, and those that want to be. And that's really it. But yeah, it's really important because people, the information you get, you don't often have a lot of time to get information, and if you get the wrong information, you're in a bad place. So hopefully people can read this book. I hate boring books, so I wrote it so you can just read the first page, and it's about that long, and you can understand the whole thing, ideally.
Having read the book, I can tell you it's not boring, it's great. And The Good Nurse is excellent too. This has been a real treat, Charlie, thank you.